Yeah, so the next time they pass around the plate asking for a tithe, I recommend you put in a bag of wheat berries. And then you go, do you realize that if we just took 200,000 of the Protestant churches alone, that would be 42 billion, with a B, billion dollars. Oh boy, as church attendance is at its lowest in history, not only are believers continuing to exit the churches, but a brand new report shows that the share of Protestant Christians' financial giving to the churches has fallen significantly, and churches really are struggling to meet their financial burdens. In the Church Executive Report, Finance Trends for 2024, they have some advice for church leaders to get more money. Make generosity a core component of discipleship. The goal of being a disciple is to become more like Jesus and raise up other disciples. Jesus was the ultimate example of generosity. During your discipleship training, share the effect a generous heart has on spiritual growth. Teach others that without individual generosity of our time and resources as Christ followers, it's impossible to raise up new disciples. And this generosity that churchgoers are pressured with will go 70% to real estate and administration expenses. And there's no biblical model for this, but there is a real solution. Welcome to Morning Tea. Hello, I'm Joanne, and I'm so glad you're here. Many have stopped going and giving because, for one, they're disgusted by the corruption, the pastors with multi-million-dollar mansions and vacation homes and the jets to get there, and of course, all the scandals that just keep coming. So first, let's clear up the tithing question, along with the guilt and the lies that compel people to pay up. In summary, the Old Testament word tithe simply means a tenth, and it was a tax that the Israelites were commanded to pay to underwrite their nation whose king was God. This tax actually was more like 20 to 30%, depending on how you calculate it, but the main breakdown is this. The Levitical tithe was 10% of agricultural produce and livestock, and it was given to support the Levites who had no land inheritance, and they were responsible for the temple duties and the services. An additional 10% was set aside for the festival tithe, which was to be spent on the food and the drink during the religious activities. And every third year, the Israelites were required to give 3.3% specifically for the poor, the widows, the orphans, and foreigners. And all this comes out to about 23.3% of the individual's income annually. There were other taxes. There was a half shekel temple tax. And over and above all of this was the free will offerings. So if a church is going to insist that you are tithing based upon Old Testament principles, well, it's not 10%, it's a minimum of 20%. And we know that no one's going to pay 20% because the average donation to a church today is just 2%. But 10% works because it's easier to swallow down, and it's much easier to convince people who don't read the scriptures for themselves to see whether what they hear from the preachers and the teachers is actually true. Like the Berean Jews, who were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they examined the scriptures to see if what Paul said was true. In the New Testament, tithing is only mentioned 3 times. The first time, Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees for their strict adherence to tithing while they neglected what was more important. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. The other incident is in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, where you have the Pharisee mentions his practice of tithing in pride, and it's contrasted with the humility of the tax collector. He says, I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all I get. But both of these mentions involve Jews under the Old Covenant paying taxes to support the government of Israel. This is before the death and resurrection of Jesus, and they just don't apply to believers under the New Covenant. And there is one other mention of Abraham giving a tithe. It's, again, 10%. And this went to Melchizedek, which is a random incident. It was spoils of war, from which we can't necessarily conclude that believers must pay 10% of their annual income to the institutionalized church, which again, 70% goes to real estate holdings and salaries. The New Testament model in some respects is similar because we do pay taxes to our governing authorities, and 23% is actually a comparable number in that our current tax system, that by the way is becoming more and more corrupt, where some people pay nothing and other people get robbed, but after paying the tax, we also have the option to give free will offerings based upon cheerful generosity. And those are the rules, that everyone must give as he's decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So if your church passes around a plate and they ask for a tithe, then you might consider putting in a bag of wheat berries or another agricultural product. The modern church building is not the Old Testament storehouse for the food of the Levites. The church is the assembling together of the believers somewhere to edify each other, to lift each other up, which we don't do very much of anymore. In the early church, the way collections worked was that they flowed through to anyone in need. In any of the churches which might have been local, they could well have been far away. It was also to support the leadership. Sometimes Paul even made it a point to support himself. He certainly would not have wanted to take from a poor group of believers, and certainly also would not have anyone thinking that they had to give in order to receive his blessings, which is the prosperity gospel lie. And this scriptural model is huge on giving. It's about sharing and caring for each other out of love for one another. So why don't you go and ask your church for a copy of the budget and just peruse through and see what the numbers look like. Ultimately, everything belongs to God. It's all his. He gives to each of us as he decides, and then we decide without compulsion, without guilt, generously, secretly, and then we don't judge what anyone else does. We're giving back to God, not just financially, but with our time, with everything. So the more wealthy assemblies of believers in their grace freedom can decide how they want to spend the offerings. If they want to spend them on building projects, that's their right. Personally, I would want to be sure that the percentages are as generous to the poor as they are to the luxury expenses like air conditioning and plushly decorated offices and the pastor perks, etc. I believe that the solution is to go back to the 1st and 2nd century model. And let's look at some numbers here. Okay, currently there are an estimated 350,000 to 380,000 Christian churches in the United States. Now, this number includes a wide range of denominations. You've got the Protestants, the Catholics, the Orthodox. The Protestant churches are around about 200 to 300,000, and they include brands like the Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Pentecostal, and non-denominational, to name a few. So the average church size is around about 100 members. This is not easy to determine and could be counted as member units like a couple or a family. The average value of a church building, which most churches own their building, and this is across the rural areas, smaller, to the suburban, to the large urban churches, the round number value of a church is $1 million. So here's what should be done. Sell the building, divide the 100 members into 5 manageable groups of about 20 who are going to meet weekly in member homes, just like the first believers did for the first couple of centuries. Then you've got to take that million and invest at 5%, which is the current rate. It's pretty low, but that alone would bring in interest income of about $50,000 annually. Now, the median family of 4 income is about $125,000, and if each one of those families donates at the estimated rate of 2%, that comes to $2,500 times 100 families, $250,000. Now you add that annually to the $50,000 interest income, and we have $300,000 annual income for the 100-member or 100-family church. So let's just say 30% of that goes to the salaries and the administration. That comes out to about $90,000. Then the remaining 70% goes to the poor, $210,000 to the poor, and this is a much more appropriate new covenant model. The teaching elders can rotate around the 5 assemblies. The believers will be edified. The poor will be helped, and the community is going to notice. Do you realize that if we just take the 200,000 Protestant Christian churches and we times that by the annual 210,000 to the poor, that's $42 billion. I have experienced this model, and it works. What happens is that as the home church grows, they split into additional homes. There can be a central management hub somewhere, someone who has a home office or a kitchen table just to manage the relatively light bookkeeping and accounting to the government agencies. Today's apps make staying in touch with members a breeze. And then you have one qualified elder per group. And by qualified, I don't necessarily mean a seminary graduate, but a proven man who meets the biblical standards that have been laid out in Timothy. He's above reproach. He's the husband of one wife. He's sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard. He's not violent, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money, and he knows how to manage his own household properly. You can see that because his children behave themselves. Also, he's not a recent convert, so that he doesn't become conceited and puffed up with his position. This man, he can make the rounds, go around to the various homes and take care of all the things and the issues that come up whenever there is a group of people close to each other, things that require wise counsel and discipline to keep the order and the integrity. The meetings will include a meal, maybe a potluck, followed by several who bring a teaching, sharing, singing, praying. You know, the focus is inward. It's toward each other. It's relaxed. It's meaningful. It's real, true connection and community. And from time to time, the home churches can get together at the local park for, a barbecue and some fun, maybe a concert, but pass out flyers to others who are frequenting the park. Their neighbors can be invited to the park. They can also be invited into the home church meetings and see for themselves what hospitality and love for one another really looks like. What do you think? Thanks so much for being here. Don't forget to look for the blessings. They're all around you. I'll see you next time.